Hello, Sensei. Hello, ministers. Um, Jumping right in, starting with Tony San. He writes about how he has been working on making the Noble Eightfold Path more practical and applicable to daily life. Something that Reverend Kubuse has been teaching us all along, which is to take all these Buddhist teachings and to make them practical and applicable to daily life. And he Tony San writes that the system that he's developed is basically cultivating positive states of mind and heart through meditation practice. Then he brings it into daily life through ethical behavior, and I think this is something phenomenal, and this is something that we're all supposed to be doing, which is to bring everything that we learn in our meditations, in our classes, and bring them out into our jobs, into our homes, to our family, and into society at large, and just make it a better place, a world that's filled more with more love and compassion. And Scott-san writes that all religions, as I'm sure history is the same thing, were originally passed down orally, and it was passed down through many generations before it was written down or documented. And I think because of this, unfortunately, we do lose some of the essence and some of the meaning and teachings. But I do believe that the the main essence of it, I think, has been captured, even though some of it probably was lost in being, passed down from generation to generation, and you know, as memory sometimes fails us. But he goes on to write that Mahayana Buddhism is more accessible to a large and diverse population. He points out that it's more simple, it's easier to understand, and easier to practice, which I think that is something that we need to do with our own practice, and as we bring it out and as we complete our course here as ministers, is to learn to make things more simple, easy to understand, and most importantly, easy to practice. It has to be easy to bring into our daily lives. Then he goes on. He writes, "No monastery needed," which I think should have been his nugget, his saying, because all it is just pointing out the importance of bringing the teachings of the Buddha to everyday people. Piyasan, I think, very accurately describes the kind of the beginning of the book, especially the historical part, as just being very dry. And I think that when you go down this, when you go down this kind of chronological route where you're, this date this happened, this date this happened, this date this happened, this book was written, then this book, then this book, then this book, almost going through a path of genealogy, I guess. It will be kind of dry and repetitive, I suppose, and boring to an extent. And she did point something out which I thought was also very funny, which is that the author refers to early Buddhism as primitive Buddhism, which is just comical. And she points out some really, really great things. One of them is that she writes that the Buddhism she practices now is far from the original Buddhism, or the primitive Buddhism, as the book calls it. But I think that this is probably the same with every other aspect of our lives, from our language to our culture to just our everyday life. Very different from the original language and culture that was here in America 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago. So it keeps evolving, and I think everything needs to evolve, because to me, evolution just means change, which is a big Buddhist principle. And then she writes something that was really good, and I think that this applies to anything, not just religion, but she writes that when any group, you know religious group, or like I said, it could be applied to any group, assigns too many rules, attempts to narrowly control its practitioners, creates dualism in practice, things always go wrong. It just doesn't work. There has to be room for growth, for creativity, and for individual thought. And then she did make me laugh at the end when she was talking about having this argument with this fellow individual she goes to AA with, where he's telling her that Buddhism wouldn't exist without Christianity, and she's telling him, well, you need to check your timeline because Buddhism was around 500 years before Christianity was. But you know, and it is comical sometimes, but I mean, I think it's always just best to just avoid these religious debates. What came first, this, that. You see these debates not just in religion, but in music. Even back when I used to follow punk rock music, the big thing was, who came up with punk rock music, and that people would say it was the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. It's an evolution, and it comes from a lot of different sources. It's not just one source. Jason San writes that he sees the different schools of Buddhism just evolving according to the time and culture. And I think that this is very important, and I think that this is something that's even happening now with us here in, and following our, American Buddhism, I guess, for better lack of a title. And it is evolving according to the time and culture, and it really has to, because people, wouldn't be able, to understand some of the older traditions and culture, especially when they're coming from a different language, a different time. It has to be applicable to the life that we live here and now, in order for this Buddhism to grow and to spread. And then he talks about the Dalai Lama and how, some Tibetan Buddhist leaders have criticized him, but after the Chinese invasion, it was the Dalai Lama that united all of the schools of Buddhism, more than anything to preserve the Tibetan culture, which was a beautiful thing. Sometimes things happen for a reason. And then Jason Sun writes about American Buddhism and how it has the possibility of uniting all the different schools of Buddhism, because we do take from all of the schools. I mean, we learn stuff from all of them. But he points out that there's also a danger of losing some of the essence of Buddhism, as American Buddhism is stripped away of all its religious aspects, which it can happen. So I think that this is something that we need to look at with love and compassion, and with, most of all, with wisdom. Seeing that some of those things, or these religious aspects, as he calls it, some of them do work for some people, and they really help them. And I think that that's something that we need to look at as we evolve here with our American Buddhism. And that's all I have today. Until the next time.